This is lecture number 2 for Unit 4B. The breakdown of Charlemagne's empire and Carolingian rule due to Charlemagne's death and then the division of his empire into smaller kingdoms resulted in a new political and social system called feudalism. It also resulted in a new economic system based on the feudal way of life called manorialism or the manor system. Between 800 and 1000 CE, near constant invasions on what had been the Carolingian Empire left it weakened and vulnerable. These invaders included Vikings from Scandinavia, included the Magyars from Eastern or Central Europe, mostly in what we now call Hungary, and Muslim invasions from what remained of the Caliphate of Cordova, or the Al-Andalus Empire. Much of the Western European population lived in places plagued by widespread disorder and suffering. During such an unstable time, feudalism is going to provide order for many people. Feudalism is a political and social system based on mutually beneficial relationships in society, which are influenced by land ownership. Similar systems of land ownership existed in places like China and Japan. In our textbook, feudalism is explained. In exchange for military protection and faithfulness, a lord, who was a landowner, granted parcels of land called a fief to a vassal, which is just a fancy word for a person receiving the land. The vassal, or person receiving the land, would pledge to protect the lord and respect them. The vassals became really wealthy and maintained their own little mini-armies made up of knights, who were horsemen who swore to protect their lords' and vassals' lands. The knights were also given smaller fiefs from the vassals in exchange for this protection. It was this political system that therefore helped to establish a social hierarchy. Ooh, my favorite term in history. Under feudalism, the social pyramid or hierarchy was divided up into 3 groups. Those who fought, including the nobles and the knights, those who prayed, men and women of the church and their leaders, and those who worked, everyone else, or the peasants. Many peasants were also called serfs and were bound to the land where they were born, and they weren't allowed to leave without permission. Whatever serfs produced was the property of their lord who owned the land. Feudalism helped to create a self-contained economy based on these lords and vassal-owned lands. Much of this land sustained itself based on manors. Manors were the lords' and vassals' estates, and all of the people who lived on these estates. Lords provided the people living on their estates with protection from invaders, and in exchange, the people living there provided their lords with labor or work. The self-contained manor system, or manorialism, was therefore the primary economic system that existed in Western Europe during much of the Middle Ages. Each manor consisted of a manor house where the lord lived, a village church for worship and gathering, and, priests kept all historical records for the largely illiterate populations back then. And they also included peasant cottages, the lord's personal field called the demesne. And, I remember this word because it sounds like domain. It's actually related to this word's Latin roots, but it looks like demesne, right? But it's pronounced demesne. Manors also included a peasant croft, which these were simply garden areas that belonged to peasants for personal use. Each manor also had a mill for grinding grain into flour, a pasture area for animals to graze, and a forested woodland area for hunting and timber for fire. The manor system set the stage for the emergence of villages every few miles in Western Europe, which we still see across much of France and Western Europe even today. Villagers on manors paid a church tax called a tithe to their village church, which was typically 1/10 of one's income. Paying a tithe, it was believed, helped to ensure that one would be rewarded in heaven or the afterlife. Village life for peasants and serfs was particularly harsh. Most houses had dirt floors, and people lived in muck and filth. Animals were often brought indoors and shared space with people in order for humans to keep warm. Beds were made of straw, and insects like fleas were everywhere. Most people never made it past 35 years of age, and disease was rampant. Traveling more than 25 miles from one's manor simply didn't happen often in one's lifetime. However, the security of living under the protection of a lord during the Middle Ages far outweighed the negative aspects. The feudal age in Europe during the Middle Ages is often referred to as the Age of Chivalry. Okay, weird word. What does this mean? Chivalry was the set of expectations for knights. It was said that the knights essentially had three masters to obey and honor. First, a knight had to honor his feudal lord, or earthly lord. Second, a knight was expected to obey his heavenly lord, or God. And finally, third, a knight was expected to honor and respect his lady, or woman. Knights were expected to behave in an honorable manner and live by this code or set of standards. Did knights always behave honorably? Well, of course not. They often treated the lower classes brutally and disrespectfully. But we still use the word chivalrous to describe polite behavior in society today. For instance, when someone holds the door for someone else, we say, "Oh, how chivalrous." In any event, knights began their training around age 7 and were sent by their families to another lord's home. As they progressed through their training, they earned titles. When they first started their training, they were called pages. And for those of you who participate in Model UN, you know that as a middle schooler, you were allowed to participate in the program as a page, as you learned the ropes, per se, of the Model UN program, and you aspired to be full-fledged participants in the committee process. Well, check out the Model UN program if you aren't sure what I'm referring to here, but listen, early knights were called pages. At age 14, following successful training, young men were called squires and were servants to knights. At around age 21, a man became a knight. Part of a knight's rite of passage included tournaments and other feats of strength like sword fighting and jousting. The early Middle Ages were also characterized by castles with large turrets and guard towers, moats and dragons. Oh, no dragons, but hey. Battles fought at or around these fortresses were most unpleasant for the attackers, who were often doused with boiling oil or molten lead. Archers stood guard on top of the castle walls, armed with crossbows. And you know what? Many of the works of literature from the early Middle Ages reflects all of this. They recount these battles and this whole way of life. The literature from this time period includes epic poems. And one of the most famous of these epics is the Song of Roland. It's a story that recreates Charlemagne's era, depicting his soldiers in battle against Islamic armies from Spain. In terms of pop culture, check out movies like Braveheart, or even better, watch the French comedy called The Visitors, or Les Visiteurs in French. Classic stuff. And of course, Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail is also a classic. Other forms of art during the Middle Ages included love poems and songs composed and performed by traveling poets and musicians called troubadours. These troubadours often performed in the courts of royal families and sent their roving or traveling minstrels to deliver poems to other noble families.